So this was in the days of Henry Ford.
Henry Ford is the guy that started the auto industry in the United States.
Okay.
And the Chrysler Brothers came in, and the General Motors through the Pappas.
Realizing that Henry Ford was a 33rd degree Freemason, that Henry Ford was one of the builders of the mechanizing the armies, the Wehrmacht for the Third Reich, and that also Henry Ford was one who mechanized the Red Army with the building of Gorky. So we have this high-level Freemason, supposedly Episcopalian. He's really an agenteur for the Jesuits out of Detroit. He circulates a series of articles in his Dearborn Independent called The International Jew, blaming the Jew for the world's woes. And yet Henry Ford is carrying on like this, persecuting his own workers in his own plants, using men like Harry Bennett. Correct?
Harry Bennett signed the paperwork, okay, having that publication put together.
I see.
Harry Bennett signed the paperwork, and it wasn't Ford's signature. Ford allowed him to sign for it. For the publication of that International Jew, Bennett was the one that signed for it. You read the International Jew itself. I've got a copy here at the house. And Bennett admits being the one that had the publication.
So knowing that the Jesuits wrote those articles, the Jesuits, probably a Detroit University Mercy there in Detroit, then Harry Bennett had to be connected with the Jesuits somehow. Wouldn't you say?
I would say that Ford had a majority of Roman Catholics, working in the factories. They pulled a lot of Protestants out from the farms. They induced them with $5 a day, which was an incredible amount of money back then for a person to earn, to leave the farm and work in his factories. That was going on big time. But you see, those farmers didn't know how Ford was operating, how he was mistreating people. I mean, some of the wives, even of the guys that worked the plant, would approach him on the street alongside of his car and run alongside of his car. And he's driving down the street in his limousine and telling him, "Mr. Ford, you're killing my husband. Stop working him so many hours." And they were working 48 to 56, 60, 70 hours, depending upon, what his demand was, to pump out those cars. The average person doesn't know what it's like to work in a factory. They have no idea to be in constant motion. Where your joints will wear out, your shoulders, your legs, your feet. You get arthritis from standing on the cement. You get lung disease from the filthy air, from the oil vapor in the air and the exhaust, the dust, the germs from the bacteria growing on the steel and the beams and the ceilings. It's filthy. My dad had severe lung problems before his death because of it.
So as an aside here, I want to remind the listener that a country can only produce wealth when capital and labor work together. When capital and labor are at war with one another, you ultimately are going to produce a deficient product, and you're ultimately going to have civil strife. So you have to have a marriage between capital and labor, because that's what produces wealth. And you also must have protective tariffs, because if you do not have protective tariffs instituted by the government that you're living under, then other foreign manufacturers can bring their goods into the country, import them in at a cheaper price, because those people in another country, say Mexico or China or what have you, are really slaves. They're working for a slave wage of what in Mexico is $2 a day. And so when they bring these goods into this country with no protective tariff, with no duty, with no raising of the product, of the cost of the product, because we're going to collect a tariff on it coming in so that we will enrich our country while at the same time protect our domestic manufacturers. As long as we have things like this in place, like NAFTA and GATT, that destroys the protection of our domestic manufacturers, we cannot continue to be a productive manufacturing country. Correct?
They deliberately raised wages in contracts, deliberately raised wages, and automatically the very next day raised the prices for food and whatever you needed in life. Everything on the market was automatically raised. So there was no gain. You see, there was no improvement for the wealth of the working man, the working class person. They deliberately put Walter and Victor Reuther and those guys in place to destroy unions and to centralize control over labor.
Well, tell the listeners who Walter and Victor Reuther were. I will mention that they were affiliated with the CFR, the Pope's Council on Foreign Relations, and that Victor Reuther had an honorary degree from Jesuit Georgetown University. But please tell us more about Victor and Walter Reuther.
Well, Walter and Victor Reuther were sent to the Soviet Union before they came to the United States and organized the United Auto Workers, before the confrontation in front of Ford's plant in Detroit or Dearborn. They went there to learn how to organize and how to use force and propaganda to manipulate workers to follow them. And they beat people up, did the same kind of things that the bosses, the straw bosses, Harry Bennett did. They went into people's homes, went after people to silence them if there's any objection to their gangster-style organization, the UAW. The Pope used Walter and Victor Reuther to centralize control of labor in the United States, in the auto industry. Didn't matter whether it was in automobile plants or aircraft plants. They all unionized them. They organized them. But they always organized them with a communist or socialist framework or structure. And deliberately raised the wages and salaries over a long period of time, especially from the late 60s and until just recently, kept raising the wages of guys in the plant deliberately. So they would create a reason for them to shut the factories down because, quote, it was costing them, that labor was the one who was to blame for them shutting down because it was too cost-effective or too costly for them to keep operating with American workers.
Okay, but the ones responsible for this, Walt, was this UAW, which was this huge centralized union. Did not this union do this? And we cannot blame this on a typical small shop union.
No.
Is that not correct?
That's correct. And you see, the smaller job shops, all it was really kind of a buffer. It was a way of a check and balance where you had some foremen who were really mean and hateful and demanding and sarcastic. They call you filthy names and smile at you, waiting for you to either punch them in the mouth or walk out the door, you see, or just take it like a man, you know, and suck it up and do your job and don't let it bother you, you know, type thing. Let them abuse and say nasty things about your wife and your kids and your family and everything. That stuff. I worked in a small job shop like that without a union. I worked in small shops where they didn't care about their workers at all. They treated them like dogs, doing tricks for them and getting the job done, you know, and not respecting them as social equals. Economic equals, no. Social equals, yes. See? And they set up dictatorship, little fiefdoms. Instead of, see, let me give you an example. You had turn of the century, even before that. You ever heard of the Stetson Hat Company? Stetson Hat?
No.
Stetson.
Oh, yes, okay.
Okay, Stetson, from what I understand, was a Christian. What I understand. I read a lengthy article in a Parade magazine one time that they had health care. His doctor took care of his workers. He provided them land, a place to put their homes. He provided education for them, schools. They're still doing it. They had profit sharing. They were involved intricately and equally and in a great respect as the guy that owned the place. All their families had, like 4, 5, 6 generations have continued working for them, even till today. And I've seen it on television a while back. They didn't treat the workers like a dog. You see, they follow a scriptural premise that teaches that masters do that which is just and right unto your servant. For you also have a master in heaven. You're going to have to answer to God for a way